It's June. That means Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference is now with all the biggest updates for the Mac developer ecosystem. For Tech Republic and ZDNet, I'm Dan Patterson with Larry Dignan and Jason Heiner. All right, so there was a ton of big updates, including the Mac, which was kind of last. Mac seems to be the bastard child of the Apple ecosystem. Larry, why does it seem as though Apple has kind of left the hardware, the computing platform that is the Mac behind?
Well, I get the lack of hardware since it is a software developer conference. But what's alarming to me is Mac's like their second biggest business. They basically forgot about it. And then the best thing they could do is come out there with like a black dark theme screen. Like the whole thing was pathetic.
Dark mode.
It's almost like you have something and you're like, well, we're just going to toss this in the end so somebody doesn't feel offended. Yeah, it was just a disaster.
They did this interesting thing where they said people have been talking for years about whether Apple is going to bring macOS and iOS together. And they said, and the answer is no. You know, and they put that real big up on the screen. And then the funny thing was, at the end of the last thing they talked about with Mac was how they're bringing iOS apps to the Mac, right? And so, you know, and they'd already started that with some of their own apps, and they're saying, and developers, we're going to let you bring your apps to your iOS apps to Mac last year. So it was almost like that whole Shakespeare, you know, thou dost protest too much thing. It's like you say it so that nobody keeps thinking it, but by the fact that they brought it up shows that, you know, they know that iOS is overshadowing everything they do with the Mac in such a big way.
Yeah, well, I guess what's alarming to me, though, is I don't know, you will never buy a Mac based on the Mac OS anymore. Because they're out of ideas. There's nothing there, right?
Yeah.
So unless you get a MacBook run by iOS, there's very little to get you excited about. I mean, that was really just, it was bad.
They didn't put too much into it. I mean, some of the most innovative things were like, on folders now, when you save all those files to your desktop, like everybody naturally does, it's going to automatically sort them into like images and PDFs and other files, which is sort of interesting and maybe useful, but at the same time, I can see that causing me as much problem as it helps, because then all of a sudden, you know, it's going to sort the thing into the folder you didn't expect it to, and then you're going to get frustrated because you can't find it there. So it was interesting that that they spent even as much time as they did on a little feature like that to try to make you know, a big deal out of something that they're clearly not putting a lot of energy into, even though it's critical for them, for all the people that are building software for iOS and the Watch and Apple TV. Like, they have to use Macs to build all that software, but they're still not giving them much.
Yeah, when you have to spend like 15 minutes on a dark theme, you're out of ideas, you got nothing.
That's how it started. So
yeah.
It started and they said, we're introducing dark mode. And then there was this like massive amount of applause, and it was kind of like, is this a joke? Like, why?
I think it was like a laugh track. It was an applause track.
It was totally a laugh track. They
it was
prepped
bad.
all of the Apple employees to applaud for that. So definitely, Apple's got to do more for the Mac if it really is going to keep people. They've got a problem there too, right? They have people, creatives, fleeing off the platform because they haven't done enough with the pro hardware. And so when they don't put as much into the software like this too, like, it has real repercussions potentially on customers that are going to be really important for them.
Did they miss any opportunities to create refinements or simplify features that could have, if not generated excitement, at least, like they said with iOS, increase performance or do things to spice up some of their legacy apps like iTunes? Larry, we talked last week about the legacy of iOS and that it's kind of code piled on code. They have the same problem with macOS. Could they have created efficiencies instead of these silly little features that might have excited the developer community?
Yeah, they could have, for sure. They could have said that, you know, because of the latest macOS, we can squeeze more out of your existing hardware, which is kind of the trick they're doing with iOS. There were things they could have done, but if they're there, they didn't show any of it.
The best thing they did along those lines is they talked about machine learning, and they now will let you take machine learning and run it, instead of running it in the cloud, you can run it on your Mac, especially Mac Pro and high-end iMac Pro, and potentially run it faster than you could in the cloud. So essentially making it easier to put machine learning into your apps. That was the best thing. They really should have doubled down more on stuff like that, especially for the developer crowd that they had there. And I'm guessing they probably will in some of the deep dive sessions that aren't the keynote. The keynote they used to tee up some of those other sessions. So that's probably the best and most innovative thing for the people that were in the room and for the developers going forward.
Yeah. Jason, to that end, I wonder if creating applications to make things like machine learning more accessible could be, and we'll talk about this in a separate video about smartphone addiction, could be Apple kind of getting ahead of the curve and talking about technologies and making technologies that seem almost impenetrable or intimidating to a consumer audience, making those things more accessible and bringing them in, just like they did with Swift, to the developer world, and making technology, instead of something that's kind of getting a bad shine lately, more accessible.
Yeah, so they're playing from behind there, in every way, in AI, machine learning. So their play is, we're going to give you the tools to do it and build it into your apps, because obviously they're struggling in their own, with Siri and with other software that they have, struggling with building in AI and machine learning into their own stuff. So I think their game is, we'll give you the opportunity to do it, which of course will bring to their platform and maybe bring smarter apps to Mac and to eventually to iOS too.
Larry, anything else that we really need to pay attention to when it comes to Mac OS? Is there anything that will really shake the business community over the next year?
I think it's steady as she goes. And then I think the long-term game plan for Apple is to put iOS on a MacBook or take the iPad Pro and let that take over for the MacBook.
All right, we have a ton more WWDC videos on Tech Republic and ZDNet. We also have guides to accompany innovations like augmented reality and machine learning. For Tech Republic and ZDNet, I'm Dan Patterson.